Hi, welcome to my channel, Math Made Easy with Laurel. I'm Laurel, and in this video we're going to take a look at the 6 trigonometric functions. So when we talk about trig functions, we're always referring to a right triangle. So these definitions only work with a right triangle, which means we have a right angle in our triangle, a 90-degree angle. And the trig functions are defined with funny names, but you just have to get comfortable with those names. But really all they represent is ratios of sides. So I'm going to show you what the ratios are, and then we'll look at how we use our calculators to find those ratios. So if I'm dealing with this angle here, which I'm going to call theta, I want to define all of the sides of my right triangle in relation to that particular angle. So across from my right angle is this side, and this is called the hypotenuse. Again, terminology that you'll want to get comfortable with because that's what it's always referred to. So it should always be the longest side, or it will always be the longest side of your right triangle because this is the largest angle in your right triangle. Then the other two sides, we're going to use the words opposite and adjacent, and they change depending on what angle you're working with. So if I'm working with this angle here, this side is opposite that side, so we call that opposite. If I was dealing with this angle, then this would be the opposite side. But I'm dealing with this angle, so that's the opposite side. And then this side here is adjacent to that angle, so we call it adjacent. And we use these names to define our trig ratios, or our trig functions. So I'm going to define the first three, the major trig functions. And the first one that I'll talk about is called the sine of my angle, and I'm going to write it out in the whole name, and then I'm going to show you the notation that's used. So you'll see SIN, and that just means sine of theta. Sine theta is defined as the ratio of the side opposite the angle to the hypotenuse. So the sine of this angle is defined as the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse. That's all it refers to. The next trig function that you're going to be working with is called cosine. And the abbreviation for that trig function is COS. So when you see COS, that means cos or cosine of your angle. And the cosine is defined as the side adjacent to the hypotenuse. So that's the definition. It's the ratio of these two sides, and in that order. The third trig function is called the tangent. And the tangent of an angle, we use TAN as our symbol or our abbreviation for that. It's defined as the side opposite. It's the ratio of the side opposite the angle to the adjacent side. And many of you will learn through your teacher or a textbook or whatever, a little acronym to help you remember this called SOHCAHTOA. And it's not easy to remember, but if you hear it enough, it may help you remember. And what SOHCAHTOA means is it's sort of the first letter. If you take sine, is defined as the ratio of the opposite over the hypotenuse. Cosine is defined as the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. And tangent is defined as the opposite side over the adjacent side. So I think a lot of students find that useful to remember what the definitions of these trig functions are. So let's talk about calculators and how we would find the trig functions, sine, cosine, or tangent of various angles using the correct function on your calculator. If you are asked to find the sine of 30 degrees, you're asked to find the ratio of the side opposite to the hypotenuse in a right triangle with the angle of 30 degrees. So if you punch it into your calculator, you will notice that you will have a sine function. And depending on your calculator, you may need to enter the angle and then your sine function. Many of you will enter sine. You will enter it just the way you see it written here, sine of 30 degrees. There are different ways that angles are expressed. Default on your calculator should be degrees. If by chance you get into radians or gradians, you're going to have problems. So just make sure you're in default mode, which is degree mode. And if you're not sure on your calculator, just look it up. So all we do is enter then sine of 30, and your answer should be 0.5. So just try it with your calculator, make sure you're doing it correctly. The next main trig function is cosine. You will have a cosine function on your calculator. Again, we're just going to press cos of 42. Some of you will need to put the angle and then your function. In either case, you should get a value of 0.74. So try it with your calculator and make sure that you are able to get the same result. Last example of these is the tangent function, which you also have on your calculator. Looks like that. So again, just press tangent of 10 degrees and see if you get the same result I obtained, which is 0.18. Okay, so remember, we're just finding ratios of different sides. Opposite over hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, opposite over adjacent. Get comfortable, practice those, and when you're ready, let's take a look at the other three trig functions, which are called the reciprocal trig functions. So in addition to these three trig functions, sine, cos, and tangent, we can also take the reciprocal ratio. So if we wanted to work with the ratio of hypotenuse to opposite, that's another trig function. So the reciprocal functions are as follows. Normally we don't write this out in words, so I'm going to abbreviate it. Cosecant is actually the reciprocal of the sine function. So if we were to flip our ratio, it will be the hypotenuse, the ratio of the hypotenuse side to the opposite side. Similarly, we have a function called secant, and the abbreviation for that is SEC, and it's the reciprocal of cosine. So it's the ratio of the side, the hypotenuse side to the adjacent side. And lastly, we have the reciprocal of tangent, which is called cotangent. And the abbreviation for cotangent is COT. It's the reciprocal of tangent. So it is the ratio of the adjacent side to the opposite side. We don't use these a great deal when we're solving right triangles. We can always use these, but as we progress in trigonometry, we are going to need to use these functions. So you want to get familiar. You certainly want to know how to find these trig functions on your calculator. So let's talk about that with some examples. So if I was asked to find the cosecant of 30 degrees, you do not have a cosecant function on your calculator. And what I find a lot of students do is they say, well, because it's reciprocal, and we've learned x to the negative 1 means 1 over x, then when they see sine to the negative 1 on their calculator, they think, well, that's got to be the reciprocal of sine. Very logical, I agree, but it is not. Mathematicians decided to use negative exponents to indicate reciprocals. So when you're working with algebraic functions, they do represent reciprocals. But when you're dealing with functions, mathematicians also decided to use a negative 1 exponent as the notation for an inverse of a function. So I'm going to talk in the next video about what sine to the negative 1 actually means, but it does not mean 1 over sine. Yes, I agree, and very confusing. However, it's the reality, so you're going to have to get comfortable in using that function when it's appropriate, and it's not appropriate right now. So what do? Well, we don't have a cosecant function on a calculator, but we do have a sine function, and we know that cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So really what we're going to find is 1 over sine of 30 degrees. So on your calculator, what I would do to start with is I would find the sine of 30 degrees, and then I simply would take the reciprocal of it using whichever reciprocal button you have on your calculator. So in this case, I would find the sine of 30 degrees, which is 0.5. I would use the reciprocal function, which on your calculator might be listed as x to the negative 1, or it might be 1 over x. And just press that after you get the result for sine of 30 degrees. So 1 over 0.5 will be equal to 2. So that's what the cosecant of 30 degrees is equal to. Let's try another one. Let's try secant. It's important to understand that secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So it's 1 over the cosine of 42 degrees. And I recommend writing it like this because I do find that if students don't take the time to write it, they're pushing buttons in the wrong order, the wrong buttons, and I see a lot of errors in this. If you take the time to write that, it helps you understand it, and it helps you punch in the correct functions on your calculator in the correct order. So I highly recommend writing that, at least until you get fairly efficient with these calculations. So we find the cos of 42 degrees first, which we found already. Then we press our reciprocal key on our calculator. And when you do that, you should get a value of 1.35. So just try it on your calculator and make sure that you're getting the same result that I'm getting. Our last example, remember, if you're asked to find the cotangent of a function, that's the reciprocal of tangent. So we start by finding the tangent of 10 degrees, which we found here. And then we take the reciprocal using our reciprocal key on our calculator, and you should get a result of 5.67. So at this point, it's important for you to practice with your calculator, practice the main trig functions where you do have the functions on your calculator, and then practice the reciprocal ones. And practice until you get them right consistently. Remember, you're finding a ratio of sides. Each of these functions just represents a ratio of 2 sides in your right triangle. In the next video, we're going to take a look at finding the inverse trig functions. So make sure you've got this down pat, and then we'll move to the next video. All right, take care. See you then.